A magnitude 4.7 earthquake just hit the Nevada desert. Nobody got hurt, no buildings fell. And within hours the story was gone, buried under sports scores and weather updates like it never happened. But here is what they didn't tell you. The fault that ruptured has a name, the Pahranagat Shear Zone, and the United States Geological Survey has formally identified it as one of the principal earthquake-producing structures in the entire southern Great Basin. Not a footnote, not a background crack in the desert floor, a principal system. That is the agency's own word. Events at this magnitude on this specific fault are statistically rare in the entire modern instrumental record. The shaking travelled 95 kilometers south and rattled chandeliers in Las Vegas high-rises, and the epicenter sits roughly 30 miles from the Nevada National Security Site, the patch of desert where the United States detonated 928 nuclear devices between 1951 and 1992. America's most tested ground, one of its most secretive, and one of the most seismically monitored places on the planet. And the timing places this earthquake exactly 14 days after an unusual magnitude 5.7 struck the Walker Lane, a completely different fault system that sits inside the same regional tectonic network, a network that silently absorbs roughly 1/4 of all the plate motion the San Andreas doesn't handle alone. 2 moderate earthquakes 2 weeks apart, 2 fault systems inside the same hidden architecture. Pattern or coincidence? That question has an answer, and it is not the one you have been given. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The detail everyone skipped. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake hit the Nevada desert. That's the headline. That's what got reported briefly on a Tuesday, between a traffic update and a segment about local restaurant closures. A minor quake, said the anchors. No damage, no injuries. Move along. And almost everyone did. But here's the thing about earthquakes that most people never stop to consider. The number, the magnitude, is almost never the most important part of the story. Where it happened, when it happened, and what it ruptured along, those are the details that tell you whether something is routine background noise or whether it's the opening note of a much longer composition. And in this case, almost every single outlet that covered this event skipped the detail that actually matters. So let's start there. Let's start with the detail they skipped. The epicenter of this earthquake was located approximately 30 kilometers south-southwest of Alamo, Nevada. If you're picturing a remote stretch of Mojave-adjacent scrubland surrounded by almost nothing, you're picturing it correctly. The town of Alamo has a population of roughly 1,000 people. The surrounding area is a patchwork of sagebrush flats, limestone ridges, and dry lake beds that haven't held standing water since the Pleistocene. It's the kind of place that doesn't make the news unless something unusual happens, and something unusual happened. Because that epicenter didn't just sit anywhere in the Nevada desert, it sat inside or immediately adjacent to one of the most structurally significant fault systems in the entire southern Great Basin, the Pahranagat Shear Zone, a left lateral fault complex that cuts across southern Nevada in a pattern that looks, from above, like someone dragged a blade diagonally across the crust. And the United States Geological Survey, not a fringe website, not a conspiracy forum, the actual federal agency responsible for monitoring the ground we all stand on, has formally identified this structure as one of the principal earthquake-producing systems in the southern Great Basin. Read that again. Principal earthquake-producing system. That's not casual language. That's USGS language. That's the kind of classification that gets assigned after decades of instrumentation, seismograph data, field mapping, and peer-reviewed publication. The Pahranagat Shear Zone is not a footnote. It is a named, mapped, structurally significant fault complex that plays an active and ongoing role in how strain moves through southern Nevada. And yet when a magnitude 4.7 earthquake ruptures along it, the story's treated like a weather footnote. Now here's why that framing is wrong. Magnitude 4.7 events on this specific structure are statistically rare in the modern instrumental era. That's the phrase that should be in every headline, not minor quake near Vegas. Statistically rare magnitude on a principal fault system. That's a different story. That's a story worth sitting with for a moment. Think about what that actually means. When seismologists compile the historical record for a given fault, every earthquake logged since the first seismograph got installed in the region, and a new event ranks near the top of that record for that specific structure, that's not nothing. That's a data point that forces a question. Why now? Why this fault? Why this magnitude when the baseline activity on this system runs in the 2.0 to 3.0 range on a good month? And then there's the shaking. Las Vegas sits roughly 95 kilometers south of the epicenter, nearly 60 miles, and people felt it. Not just people on the ground either. People in high-rise hotels and residential towers reported chandeliers swaying, windows rattling in their frames, that low rolling kind of motion that doesn't feel like a sharp jolt. More like the building itself is gently disagreeing with you. High-rise structures amplify long-period seismic waves. The taller the building, the more it wants to sway in resonance with certain frequencies. So what might feel like a faint tremor at street level can translate into something genuinely unnerving on the 40th floor, and 95 kilometers away. Let that distance sink in, so you have a statistically rare magnitude event on a principal fault system, generating shaking felt nearly 60 miles away in one of the most densely populated desert cities on Earth. And the story got maybe 6 paragraphs of wire copy before disappearing. But here's what made this story completely impossible to walk away from: the timing. Because this earthquake did not occur in isolation. It occurred exactly 14 days after a magnitude 5.7 earthquake struck Silver Springs, Nevada, a completely different location, but within the same broader regional fault system known as the Walker Lane. 2 moderate earthquakes, the same interconnected tectonic framework, 14 days apart. Now, is that proof of a connection? No. Is it suggestive? Absolutely. Is it the kind of timing that, when you overlay it on a map of known fault linkages and stress transfer pathways, makes serious seismologists sit forward in their chairs and start pulling up data? Yes. That is exactly what that kind of timing does. And that's the tension at the centre of this story. Not the shaking, not the proximity to sensitive facilities, though we will get to that. Not the depth uncertainty, though that matters too. The tension is this. We may be watching a linked system of fault zones, a system that quietly absorbs a staggering fraction of the strain generated by an entire continental plate boundary, doing something that our models still can't fully predict. Releasing stress in a way that propagates, in a way that doesn't follow the simple one fault, one earthquake story that most of us learned in school. This is not about damage. Nobody was hurt. Buildings didn't fall. The Las Vegas Strip kept spinning its lights into the sky just as it does every other Tuesday. This is about pattern recognition. This is about the difference between a random desert tremor and an event that is telling us something about how an entire tectonic system is behaving right now, in real time, in 2025. And to understand what it's telling us, we have to zoom out, way out, beyond this fault, beyond Nevada, beyond anything that fits on a regional map. Because this story didn't start at the Pahranagat Shear Zone. This story started with the way the western edge of a continent is being slowly, relentlessly, invisibly torn apart. This didn't start here. Part 2. The geometry nobody shows. Most people's mental image of a fault is a crack, a single, clean fracture in the Earth's crust running in a straight line from point A to point B, and when it slips, you get an earthquake. That image is tidy. It's also fundamentally misleading for a large portion of the world's most seismically active regions, and it's almost entirely wrong for the structure we're discussing today. Faults are not cracks, at least not the kind of faults that do the heavy lifting in tectonically complex regions. What you actually find when you're doing field mapping, when you're running LiDAR surveys from aircraft, when you're processing decades of seismograph data, is something more like a braid. A distributed zone of deformation spread across multiple strands, each one capable of moving independently, each one transferring stress to its neighbours in ways that aren't always predictable from the surface. And the Pahranagat Shear Zone is exactly this kind of structure. The zone is not one fault, it's a system. The dominant strand in the complex is known as the Maynard Lake Fault, which runs roughly northwest to southeast across Lincoln County, Nevada, cutting through some of the loneliest terrain in the American Southwest. But it's accompanied by at least 2 other significant structures, the Buckhorn Fault and the Arrowhead Mine Fault, that run roughly parallel and interact with the primary strand in ways that seismologists are still actively trying to characterize. These aren't separate faults that happen to be nearby, they're part of the same deformation system, responding to the same regional stress field, and they almost certainly influence each other's behaviour. This matters enormously when you're trying to understand why the system produced a magnitude 4.7 on a specific day. Because when deformation is distributed across multiple strands, there's no single rupture surface that controls everything. Stress doesn't concentrate in one predictable spot and then release in one predictable way. Instead, it distributes. It diffuses across the whole braid. And when enough of it accumulates in one part of the braid, you get an earthquake. But the specific location, the specific magnitude, the specific timing, those emerge from the interaction of all the strands together, not just the one that finally slips. Now here's the motion that makes this system particularly interesting. The Pahranagat Shear Zone is a left lateral fault system. That term gets thrown around a lot in earthquake coverage without much explanation, so let's take 10 seconds to make it concrete. Imagine you're standing on one side of the fault looking across it. In a left lateral system, the block on the other side of the fault moves to your left, as opposed to right lateral motion, where it moves to your right. The San Andreas Fault, which most Americans are at least vaguely familiar with, is right lateral. The Pahranagat Shear Zone moves in the opposite rotational sense. Picture two blocks of crust sliding past each other like two hands being rubbed together, but with the left hand always pulling forward. That's the dominant motion on this system, and it places this fault in a specific mechanical context within the broader regional stress field. A context that, as it turns out, is absolutely critical for understanding what role this structure plays in the bigger picture. Because here is where the geometry gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely important. The Pahranagat Shear Zone doesn't just exist in isolation. It occupies a boundary zone, a mechanical transition, between two distinct deformation regimes in the southern Great Basin. To the north and west, you have one style of crustal extension and strain accommodation. To the south and east, a different style. And the Pahranagat Shear Zone sits at the interface between them, which means it isn't just a local fault that occasionally produces earthquakes. It functions as what geophysicists sometimes call a stress transfer corridor, a structural pathway through which strain energy can move from one part of the plate boundary system to another. Think of it like a relay baton in a race. Stress builds in one part of the system. It needs somewhere to go. The geometry of the shear zone provides a pathway, and the stress moves, not instantly, not dramatically, but incrementally, over weeks, months, years, until it finds a place to release. And here's the part that most earthquake coverage never gets to. There is a growing body of scientific literature suggesting that the Pahranagat Shear Zone may be structurally linked, mechanically connected, to both the Walker Lane system to the north and the Eastern California Shear Zone to the south and west. If that linkage is real, and if it's as mechanically significant as some researchers believe, then the Pahranagat isn't just a regional fault. It's a bridge, a mechanical bridge between two of the most significant tectonic systems on the western edge of North America. Now, to be scrupulously honest here, because this is a channel that cares about the difference between what we know and what we're still figuring out, the precise nature and extent of that linkage is not fully resolved in the scientific literature. There are researchers who argue strongly for a connected, integrated system. There are others who think the connections are more tenuous, more intermittent, more dependent on specific stress conditions. This is an active area of research, not a settled question, and that uncertainty is itself part of the story, because it means that when a significant event occurs on the Pahranagat, the scientific community can't say with confidence whether it's talking to the Walker Lane, talking to the Eastern California Shear Zone, or keeping to itself. But here's the key insight that the geometry gives us, regardless of where you land on the connectivity debate. When deformation is distributed across multiple strands, and when those strands are potentially connected to larger regional systems, the behavior of the system as a whole becomes fundamentally harder to predict than any single fault model would suggest. Individual segments can release stress in ways that appear disconnected from each other at the surface, while at depth, they're responding to the same regional pressure field. Moderate events can appear to come from nowhere because the build-up was happening across the entire braid, not concentrating visibly on any single strand. And stress changes caused by one event, like say a magnitude 5.7 in Silver Springs 2 weeks ago, can propagate through the system in ways that only become apparent when another fault, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away, suddenly produces its own out-of-pattern release. This is not a fault that fails alone. That's the sentence that should be sitting in the back of your mind as we go forward. Whatever the Pahranagat Shear Zone does, it's doing it as part of a network. And networks, as anyone who's ever watched one domino fall into another will tell you, have a way of doing things that individual components never would on their own. The geometry of this system makes the behaviour unpredictable. And unpredictability, when we're talking about a fault structure that sits between two major tectonic corridors and produces statistically rare magnitude events with almost no warning, is not a reassuring word, but it's the right word. And if the geometry is complex, we should expect the behaviour to be complex too. And complex behaviour, as we're about to see, is exactly what the data is showing us. Part 3. The statistical red flag. Numbers in seismology are deceptive. They look precise. They look objective. A magnitude 4.7 sounds like a specific, measurable, fully characterized thing. But the number is almost useless without context, without knowing what's typical for this fault, without knowing what the background seismicity looks like, what the historical record shows, and what it means when a system that usually produces small events suddenly jumps to something much larger. And when you put this earthquake in its proper statistical context, the picture changes completely. The baseline seismicity on the Pahranagat Shear Zone runs in the magnitude 2 to 3 range. That's typical background noise for an active fault system in the Basin and Range province. Small earthquakes, usually too small to feel, occurring at irregular intervals as the fault system slowly accumulates and releases the stress being constantly delivered by the regional tectonic machinery. These are the events that keep the seismograph needles twitching at monitoring stations across southern Nevada, barely registering above the noise floor, generating no headlines and no concern. In the month before the magnitude 4.7 struck, the largest recorded event near this fault was approximately magnitude 2.1. 2.1. That's the kind of event that gets picked up by sensitive instruments and logged in a database, but that almost no human being on the surface of the planet would ever notice even if they were standing directly above it. Now here is the number that should stop you cold. The relationship between earthquake magnitude and energy released is not linear. It's logarithmic, which means each full unit increase on the Richter scale represents roughly 32 times more energy released. Not twice as much, 32 times as much. So when you go from magnitude 2 to magnitude 3, you're releasing 32 times more energy. From 2 to 4, roughly 1,000 times more. From 2.1, the previous maximum on this fault for the preceding month, all the way to magnitude 4.7, you are looking at approximately 5,000 times more energy released in a single event than the previous largest earthquake in that recent window. 5,000 times! That's not a gradual escalation. That's not a system that warmed up, showed signs of increasing activity, gave monitoring networks time to raise alert levels, and then produced a moderate event as the logical conclusion of an observable trend. That's a system that was running quietly at background levels and then, with almost no transitional signal, produced an event 5,000 times more energetic than anything it had done recently. In the earthquake world, that kind of jump is what researchers sometimes call a state change, a sudden transition from one mode of behaviour to another that doesn't have obvious precursors in the immediately preceding record. And here's the broader statistical context that makes this even more striking. Magnitude 4.5 and above events on the Pahranagat Shear Zone are rare in the modern instrumental record. Not unprecedented. This isn't the first time a significant event has occurred here, but the modern era of dense seismic instrumentation, which gives us the highest quality and most complete catalogue of small to moderate earthquakes, shows that events of this size on this specific structure happen only a handful of times across several decades. This magnitude 4.7 sits at or near the upper bound of what the instrumented record shows for this fault. It's not the largest earthquake ever associated with this system. The geological record, which we can read in the scarps and offset features exposed in the Nevada desert, tells a longer story that includes larger events in the more distant past. But in the era of precise seismic monitoring, this event represents something statistically uncommon. What that rarity tells us is something subtle but important. It's tempting to think about faults in terms of big events and small events, as if the size distribution is random, but seismologists understand that fault systems have characteristic behaviours. tendencies towards certain magnitude ranges, certain recurrence intervals, certain spatial patterns that reflect the underlying mechanics of how stress accumulates and releases on that specific structure. When an event falls outside the typical range, when it's significantly larger than what the system usually produces, it's worth asking what changed. What allowed stress to accumulate to a level that this fault doesn't usually reach? What was different about the state of the system on this particular day that allowed a 4.7 to happen when background levels had been sitting at 2.1? There's another statistical anomaly worth noting here, and it's one that usually gets buried in the technical literature rather than making it into public earthquake reporting. There was no obvious foreshock sequence leading up to this event, no clear escalation of small earthquakes in the hours or days before the main shock that would have provided even a whisper of warning. The fault just went, directly from background noise to a statistically rare release, without the kind of preparatory signal that might allow someone to connect the dots in advance. Now, absence of foreshocks is not unusual for earthquakes generally. Most moderate events don't announce themselves, but it does mean that whatever process allowed stress to reach release threshold on this fault happened entirely invisibly from a surface monitoring perspective, and that invisibility is itself a clue. If the stress that drove this earthquake had been building locally, on a single strand of the shear zone, in a simple linear way, you might expect some precursory microseismicity, some cracking and adjusting of the crust as it approached failure. The fact that the system went from quiet to release, without that visible build-up, suggests one of two things. Either the stress accumulation was distributed across the fault network in a way that prevented any single location from producing detectable precursors until the final failure, or the triggering mechanism wasn't primarily local build-up at all. It was external. Stress delivered from somewhere else in the system, arriving at the Pahranagat zone at threshold level and pushing a section of fault that was already loaded to its limit, which brings us back, inevitably, to the central question driving this whole investigation. This earthquake on the Pahranagat Shear Zone, a statistically rare event, preceded by no clear escalation, jumping from background levels to a magnitude that ranks near the top of the modern instrumental record, appears not to have been a simple, self-contained local release. It looks, from the statistics alone, like the system didn't gradually build toward this. It looks like the system was pushed, and if it was pushed, then something outside this fault, something in the broader regional network in the linked shear zone system that quietly absorbs so much of the strain along this plate boundary, is doing the pushing. This wasn't a build-up. This was a release. And when something gets released, the question that immediately follows is, what triggered it? And to answer that question properly, we have to understand one more piece of the local picture before we zoom out to the regional scale. Because the depth of this earthquake, or rather the uncertainty around its depth, adds another layer to an already complicated story. Part 4. The shallow depth problem. Here is something that earthquake reporting almost never explains, even though it fundamentally determines how much shaking an event produces at the surface and how far that shaking travels. The depth of the rupture matters as much as the magnitude. In some cases, it matters more. A magnitude 5 earthquake at 2 kilometers depth can cause far more surface damage than a magnitude 5 earthquake at 20 kilometers depth. The energy release is the same. The effect on the things that humans care about, buildings, roads, pipes, people, is completely different. And for the Nevada magnitude 4.7, the depth is one of the most genuinely uncertain parameters in the whole dataset. The United States Geological Survey's best estimate for the focal depth of this earthquake, after processing the waveform data from the regional seismic network, comes in at approximately 13.6 kilometers. That's roughly mid-crustal depth for this part of the Basin and Range province, not unusually shallow, not unusually deep. A reasonable number for a standard fault rupture in a region where the brittle ductile transition in the crust typically occurs somewhere between 12 and 18 kilometers. If the depth is truly 13.6 kilometers, then the shaking at the surface was broadly consistent with what you'd expect from a moderate earthquake at that depth in this type of crust. But there's a problem. Preliminary depth estimates for earthquakes in remote regions, where station coverage is uneven and the seismic velocity structure of the crust is not perfectly well characterized, can carry significant uncertainties. And in the initial hours after this earthquake, some preliminary analyses were generating depth estimates as shallow as approximately 6.5 kilometers, half the USGS final estimate. That's not a rounding error, that's a qualitatively different kind of earthquake. An event at 6 kilometers depth in the Nevada crust would propagate its energy to the surface far more efficiently, would generate higher peak ground accelerations in the near field, and would produce a much larger felt area than the same event at 13 kilometers. The reason depth uncertainty exists and why it matters for this specific event comes down to the physics of how seismic waves propagate through different types of crust. The Basin and Range Province, the geological province that covers most of Nevada and extends into parts of Utah, Arizona, Idaho, and California, is characterized by a crust that has been stretched, thinned, and structurally modified by millions of years of extensional tectonics. This stretching has produced a distinctive crustal structure that includes alternating blocks of relatively dense, brittle upper crust and more ductile lower crust, all sitting atop a mantle that in some places is anomalously warm and in others is at more typical temperatures. One property of basin and range crust that's particularly relevant here is what seismologists call the quality factor, or Q, a measure of how efficiently seismic energy travels through the rock without being attenuated or absorbed. Western United States crust, including basin and range crust, generally has higher Q values than comparable crust in the eastern United States. That means seismic waves travel farther with less energy loss. The same magnitude earthquake in Nevada will be felt at greater distances than the same magnitude earthquake in, say, the Appalachians. It's not that Nevada earthquakes are more powerful, it's that the crust in Nevada is a more efficient transmitter of seismic energy. The waves travel farther before they dissipate. This is why a magnitude 4.7 in the Nevada desert was felt in high-rise buildings in Las Vegas, 95 kilometers away. The combination of moderately shallow rupture, high Q basin and range crust, and the architectural amplification properties of tall buildings conspired to carry seismic energy across a much larger geographic footprint than the raw magnitude number would suggest. When residents on upper floors of Las Vegas hotels and condominiums described chandeliers swaying and windows rattling from what the news was calling a minor earthquake nearly 60 miles away, they weren't imagining it. They were experiencing the real physics of how this kind of rupture, in this kind of crust at this kind of depth, actually behaves. The modified Mercalli intensity scale, the scale that describes how shaking is experienced by people at different locations, as opposed to how much energy was released at the source, probably reached intensity 3 to 4 in the Las Vegas area for this event. That's the range described as felt indoors by many, outdoors by few during the day, some awakened at night, disturbance of liquids, rocking of suspended objects. Not damage-producing, not dangerous in any direct sense, but perceptible over an enormous area, with that distinctive high-floor amplification making it feel significantly more dramatic in tall structures than in single-story buildings, or at street level. The felt area envelope for this earthquake, based on the reports that came in through the USGS Did You Feel It system, appears to have extended roughly 95 to 110 kilometers from the epicenter in multiple directions. That's a larger felt radius than you'd typically expect for a magnitude 4.7 in most parts of the world. It's consistent with what you get when you combine moderately shallow focal depth, efficient crustal wave propagation, and the basin amplification effects associated with the thick sedimentary sequences under Las Vegas Valley. Now here's the implication that goes beyond just explaining why the shaking reached Las Vegas. If similar events, magnitude 4 to 5 earthquakes on the Pahranagat Shear Zone or nearby structures, were to occur with any regularity during a period of elevated regional activity, the felt area would consistently extend to one of the most populated urban centers in the American Southwest. Las Vegas currently has a metropolitan population of approximately 2.3 million people. Most of the building stock is relatively modern and reasonably well engineered for the seismic hazard that has historically been assigned to that area. But seismic hazard assessments are based on historical earthquake records and fault models, and if those models are underestimating the potential for linked system behavior, if the Pahranagat, Walker Lane and Eastern California Shear Zone are more connected than standard hazard models assume, then the hazard picture for southern Nevada may be more nuanced than the existing assessments reflect. But depth, as revealing as it is about the mechanics of how this earthquake propagated, doesn't tell us the most interesting part of the story. Depth tells us how this earthquake was felt. it doesn't tell us why this fault produced this event at this particular moment in time. For that, we have to move beyond the immediate parameters of the earthquake itself and confront the geographic context that makes the location of this event genuinely, uncomfortably interesting. Part 5. The location nobody wants to lead with. 30 miles. That's the approximate distance between the epicenter of the magnitude 4.7 Pahranagat Shear Zone earthquake and the boundary of the Nevada National Security Site. 30 miles, which in the Nevada desert, where the scale of the terrain tends to flatten your sense of distance, doesn't feel like very far at all. The Nevada National Security Site, known for most of its operational life as the Nevada Test Site, is one of the most consequential pieces of land in American history. Between 1951 and 1992, the United States government conducted 928 nuclear tests at this location. 928. 100 of those were atmospheric tests, detonated in the open air above the desert floor before the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 moved the program underground. The remaining 828 tests were conducted in shafts and tunnels bored into the Nevada crust, releasing enormous amounts of energy directly into the rock at depths ranging from a few hundred meters to over a kilometer. The sheer scale of what happened at that site over those 4 decades is almost impossible to process intuitively. The largest underground tests released the energy equivalent of hundreds of thousands of tons of TNT. The ground shook for miles in every direction. Craters formed at the surface above collapsed test shafts. And the cumulative effect of 928 energy releases, some of them substantial, on a piece of crust that was already part of an active seismic system is, to put it diplomatically, not something that has been entirely closed as a scientific question. Before we go any further, let's be completely clear about something. There is no evidence, not a shred, that the magnitude 4.7 Pahranagat Shear Zone earthquake of 2025 was caused by any current activity at the Nevada National Security Site. The United States has not conducted a nuclear test since 1992, when a moratorium on testing was established. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, while not yet formally ratified by the United States Senate, has been observed as policy. The monitoring infrastructure of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, an international network of seismographs, hydroacoustic sensors, infrasound arrays, and radionuclide detectors, would identify a nuclear detonation with extraordinary precision. There was no such detection. This earthquake produced the waveform signature of a tectonic fault rupture, not an explosion. The scientific distinction between the two is well established and reliable. So no, this was not a test. This was not a triggered event from current operations. That much is clear, but here's where it gets genuinely nuanced and genuinely interesting, in a way that responsible science communication requires acknowledging rather than suppressing. The question of what 928 underground nuclear tests have done to the long-term stress state of a piece of seismically active crust over decades of post-test stress redistribution and fluid migration has not been definitively closed in the peer-reviewed literature. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a legitimate area of scientific inquiry that appears in respectable geophysical journals. The specific question of how energetic underground disturbances can alter stress fields in surrounding crust, potentially affecting fault behavior on timescales of years to decades rather than seconds to minutes, is a real scientific question with real uncertainties attached to it. The reason this matters contextually, rather than causally, is that the Nevada National Security Site sits within the same regional stress field as the Pahranagat Shear Zone. The crust beneath and around the test site has been instrumented, monitored, and studied more intensively than almost any comparably remote region in the United States, precisely because of the test history. That monitoring legacy means there's actually more data available about the seismic behavior of this region than there would be otherwise, which means scientists studying the Pahranagat Shear Zone have access to a richer instrumentation record than they'd have if the test site didn't exist. The proximity also has a narrative effect that is worth naming directly. When a significant earthquake occurs near the most prolific nuclear test site in American history, public attention is disproportionately captured by the proximity itself. The speculation flows immediately and predictably: secret tests, triggered events, deliberate detonations, government cover-ups. And that narrative noise, while entirely understandable given the history, tends to drown out the actual scientific story. The actual scientific story, in this case, is far more interesting than any of those theories, not because it involves secret activity, but because it involves a poorly understood natural system behaving in a way that reveals genuine gaps in our knowledge. The location is interesting, the system is more important. The Pahranagat Shear Zone earthquake is significant not because of what's 30 miles to the west, but because of what it tells us about how stress moves through a fault network that is quietly absorbing a major fraction of the strain generated by one of the most tectonically active continental margins on Earth. And to understand that, we need to zoom out one more time, way out, all the way to the scale of plate boundaries and continental mechanics, because the story of this earthquake is ultimately the story of a hidden plate boundary, and almost nobody knows it exists. Part 6. The Hidden Plate Boundary. Here is the thing that most people believe because it's what most people are taught. The boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate is the San Andreas Fault. California moves north relative to the rest of the continent. The San Andreas accommodates that motion. Big earthquakes happen on the San Andreas. That's the story. Clean, simple, geographically intuitive. It's also incomplete in a way that has enormous consequences for understanding seismic risk across the entire American West. The San Andreas Fault accommodates approximately 3/4 of the relative motion between the Pacific and North American plates. That's the part of the story that's correct, but 3/4 is not all of it. The remaining roughly 20 to 25% of the total plate boundary motion that represents a significant component of continental scale strain, doesn't happen on the San Andreas at all. It happens somewhere else. It happens across a broad, diffuse zone of deformation that extends from southeastern California across the Mojave Desert, across most of Nevada, and up into parts of Oregon and Idaho. A zone that's several hundred kilometers wide, a zone that includes the Eastern California Shear Zone, the Walker Lane Belt, the Wasatch Fault System, the Central Nevada Seismic Belt, and, sitting at a critical structural junction within all of this, the Pahranagat Shear Zone. Geophysicists have a term for what this zone represents. They call it a diffuse plate boundary. Rather than a single, discrete fault line marking the transition between two tectonic plates, you have a broad swath of crust across which plate boundary deformation is distributed among hundreds of faults of varying sizes, orientations, and activity levels. This isn't unusual in global plate tectonics. In fact, diffuse plate boundary zones are found on multiple continents. But the one that cuts through the American West is particularly interesting because it's one of the most well-instrumented, most actively studied, and, despite decades of research, still one of the most incompletely understood of these zones anywhere on Earth. The Walker Lane Belt, specifically, is the northern arm of this diffuse boundary. It runs roughly north-northwest through western Nevada and into northeastern California, accommodating somewhere between 10 and 20 millimeters per year of right lateral shear, the same basic motion sense as the San Andreas, just distributed across a much broader zone. The Eastern California Shear Zone occupies the southern arm, running through the Mojave Desert and into southeastern California. Together, these two systems form what some researchers describe as a protoplate boundary, a zone that may, over geologic time, evolve into a well-defined discrete plate boundary as the San Andreas becomes progressively less able to accommodate the full plate motion along its highly curved southern segment. Now here's why this matters for the earthquake we're discussing. The Pahranagat Shear Zone sits at a geometric junction between the Walker Lane to the north and the Eastern California Shear Zone to the south and southwest. In the distributed deformation model of the western United States, the view of the plate boundary as a broad interconnected network of faults rather than a single line. The Pahranagat doesn't sit on the periphery of the action. It sits close to the centre of the handoff zone between the two major arms of the diffuse boundary. It's structurally positioned to act as a relay fault, a structure that transfers strain between two larger systems that can't directly connect to each other. Think of it like a switchyard in a railroad network. The Walker Lane is coming in from the north, the Eastern California Shear Zone is departing to the south and west, and the Pahranagat Shear Zone sits at the junction, providing the structural geometry for strain to transfer between the two. If you accept this model, and the geophysical literature contains substantial evidence for it, even if the precise mechanics remain debated, then what happens on the Pahranagat is not just a local event. It's a communication between two of the most significant fault systems in the continental United States. This model also explains something that might otherwise seem puzzling. Why does the region around central and southern Nevada produce moderate earthquakes, magnitude 4 to 5 events, with a regularity that seems disproportionate to the obvious surface expression of faulting? If you look at a standard geological map of Nevada, you see the characteristic basin and range structure, parallel mountain ranges separated by flat valleys, all of it the product of east-west crustal extension. But there aren't the kinds of large, prominent fault scarps that you'd associate with major seismic hazard, the way you see them along the Wasatch Front in Utah or along the eastern escarpment of the Sierra Nevada in California. The landscape doesn't scream active tectonics in the way those regions do, but the seismograph doesn't lie. The instrumented record for central and southern Nevada shows ongoing moderate seismicity, not rare, not anomalous, ongoing, because the crust in this region is absorbing plate boundary strain, distributed across dozens of faults in a system that doesn't have a single dominant structure to point to as the obvious culprit. The strain goes in everywhere and comes out everywhere. As moderate earthquakes on structures like the Pahranagat Shear Zone, on the central Nevada seismic belt, on unnamed and partially mapped fault strands that have never generated a headline or produced a named event in the modern era. The 2010 paper in the journal Geology, one of the most important pieces of literature on this topic, made a striking argument for the coherence of this system. The authors presented evidence suggesting that the Walker Lane and Eastern California Shear Zone are not just geometrically proximate, they're mechanically linked in a way that allows stress changes in one part of the system to influence behaviour in the other. If that linkage is real, and if the Pahranagat Shear Zone is indeed the structural relay between them, then we have a system with very long reach, a system where an earthquake in Walker Lane can, in principle, deliver a stress perturbation to the Pahranagat Zone, which can in turn influence the Eastern California Shear Zone, a chain of influence stretching from central Nevada to the Mojave Desert, mediated by a fault structure in one of the emptiest parts of the American Southwest. And that brings us to the timing. Because if we're going to argue that this system can relay stress across several hundred kilometers, then the question of whether the magnitude 5.7 Silver Springs earthquake, 14 days before the Pahranagat event, played a role in triggering or advancing the Nevada earthquake becomes not just plausible, but physically motivated. And that brings us to the 2-week gap that matters more than any headline you read about either of these earthquakes. Part 7. The 2-week gap that matters. April 14th, 2025. Silver Springs, Nevada. A magnitude 5.7 earthquake ruptures on a fault within the Walker Lane Belt in western Nevada. It's a significant event, strong enough to cause minor damage in nearby communities, strong enough to be felt across a large portion of the state, strong enough to generate 2 days of national news coverage before the news cycle moved on to something else. By the standards of what the Walker Lane typically produces, it's an above-average event, noteworthy, studied. And then, 14 days later, 400 kilometers to the south-southeast, the Pahranagat Shear Zone produces a magnitude 4.7, 2 earthquakes, 2 weeks apart, 2 different fault systems, same regional tectonic framework. The question is whether the connection is real or coincidental. And to answer that question properly, you need to understand something about how earthquakes talk to each other, because they do talk, not in any metaphorical sense, in a very literal, physically measurable sense. When a fault ruptures, it doesn't just release energy at the epicenter, it changes the stress state of the surrounding crust in a way that propagates outward. There are 2 distinct mechanisms by which this happens. The first is called static stress transfer, a permanent, instantaneous change in the stress field of the surrounding crust, caused by the deformation of the rocks during the rupture. The fault moves, the rocks on either side deform, and the stress redistribution from that deformation propagates into the surrounding crust and remains there. It doesn't decay over time in the way that seismic waves do, it persists, and it can, depending on the geometry of the receiving fault relative to the sending fault, either increase or decrease the probability of failure on faults in the affected region. The second mechanism is dynamic stress transfer, the passing of seismic waves themselves through the crust. These waves can trigger seismicity at great distances by momentarily perturbing the stress state of crust that's already close to failure. Unlike static stress changes, dynamic triggering tends to be transient. The waves pass through, the perturbation happens, and if a fault was already loaded near its failure threshold, the additional stress pulse can be enough to push it over. Dynamic triggering can occur at distances of hundreds to thousands of kilometers from the original rupture, which is why large earthquakes sometimes trigger seismicity in regions that appear completely unrelated geographically. In the case of the Walker Lane magnitude 5.7 and the Pahranagat magnitude 4.7, both mechanisms are at least physically plausible. The static stress change from the Silver Springs rupture would have propagated into the surrounding crust, including the region occupied by the Pahranagat Shear Zone instantaneously. Whether it increased or decreased the Coulomb failure stress on the specific Pahranagat fault strands that eventually ruptured depends on geometry, the orientation of the sending and receiving faults relative to each other and to the regional stress field. That's a calculation that requires precise fault geometry data for both structures, and it hasn't been published for this specific event pair at the time of this video. But the physical mechanism for static stress transfer across this distance in this type of connected fault system is entirely within the realm of the established science. The 14-day delay is interesting. Static stress transfer happens instantaneously, so why would there be a 14-day lag before the Pahranagat event? This is where a third mechanism comes into play. Seismologists have documented a phenomenon called post-seismic stress relaxation, in which the crust surrounding a recent rupture continues to adjust over days, weeks, and sometimes months following a large earthquake. Fluids migrate in response to the pressure changes caused by the rupture. Viscoelastic lower crust and upper mantle deform slowly under the redistributed load. These processes can continue delivering stress to surrounding faults well after the initial rupture, advancing the timing of earthquakes that might otherwise have occurred years later. A 14-day delay between a magnitude 5.7 and a possible triggered event is completely consistent with this kind of post-seismic stress evolution. Now, and this is where scientific honesty requires a clear statement, we cannot prove causation here. Two events in the same regional system 2 weeks apart are not sufficient to demonstrate that one triggered the other. The Walker Lane and the Southern Great Basin both produce earthquakes on their own timescales, driven by the continuous delivery of tectonic strain from the plate boundary. It is entirely possible that the Pahranagat earthquake was going to happen anyway, that it was independently loaded, independently timed, and the Silver Springs event was genuinely coincidental. Timing alone doesn't establish physical connection. What timing does establish is that this possibility deserves serious attention, because if you look at the historical catalogue of Walker Lane and Southern Great Basin seismicity, sequences in which a significant Walker Lane event is followed within days to weeks by a moderate event in the Southern Great Basin are not unprecedented. They're not common enough to be a statistical certainty, but they're common enough that the research community takes this kind of temporal correlation seriously as a hypothesis worth testing rather than dismissing. The research community also takes seriously something that the general public almost never thinks about: the concept of a stress shadow and a stress loading zone. When a fault ruptures, it doesn't just potentially advance failure on nearby faults, it also reduces stress on some faults, particularly faults that are oriented such that the stress change from the rupture moves them away from failure rather than toward it. These regions of reduced stress are called stress shadows, and faults within them become statistically less likely to rupture in the near term. The complement of the stress shadow is the stress loading zone, the region where the static stress change from the rupture advances the loading on faults that are already accumulating strain. If the Pahranagat Shear Zone sits within the stress loading zone of the Silver Springs rupture, if the geometry works out in the right direction, then the magnitude 4.7 may have been genuinely advanced in time by the Walker Lane event. Not created from nothing, but moved forward from whenever it would otherwise have occurred. This is not the only movement that was happening in the region during this period, and when you add the smaller anomalies to the picture, the out-of-pattern seismicity that appeared in several other locations around the same time, the possibility of a regional stress pulse becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence, because this wasn't the only movement. Part 8. The Chain Reaction Hypothesis. Any serious scientist will tell you that 2 data points are not enough to establish a pattern. You need sample size, you need statistical power, you need multiple independent lines of evidence pointing in the same direction before you can claim that what you're seeing is a signal rather than noise. And yet, any serious scientist will also tell you that when you're trying to understand the behavior of a complex interconnected fault system, you pay attention to anomalies. You flag them. you add them to the picture and ask whether they fit a coherent narrative or whether they're genuinely random. In the period surrounding the Silver Springs and Pahranagat earthquakes, several other seismic anomalies were recorded in locations that, on a standard seismicity map, appear to form a spatial arc across the western United States. A magnitude 2.8 earthquake in the Granite Bay area of Northern California, a location with very limited historical seismicity and no obvious connection to the major active fault systems of the region. A magnitude 2.7 event near Bakersfield, in the southern San Joaquin Valley, occurring in a context that raised questions about its relationship to ongoing subsidence and fluid extraction in the region, but that also sits within the broader stress field of the southern Sierra Nevada and Mojave Desert. Individually, none of these events are remarkable. Magnitude 2.7 and 2.8 earthquakes happen somewhere in the western United States essentially every day. The Granite Bay event is more interesting because of the relative scarcity of seismicity in that specific location, but even a rare small event in a quiet zone is a long way from evidence of a regional stress pulse. The Bakersfield event involves enough confounding factors from oil and gas operations that attributing it to tectonic stress redistribution is genuinely uncertain. But here's the observation that makes these events worth mentioning, even with all those caveats attached. When you plot these events on a map alongside the Silver Springs and Pahranagat earthquakes, and you overlay the known structural connections between the Walker Lane, the Eastern California Shear Zone, the Southern Sierra Nevada, and the Mojave Desert, the spatial distribution of these anomalies traces a rough arc that is geometrically consistent with a regional stress redistribution propagating outward from the Walker Lane event. Not perfectly consistent, the geometry is messy, the timing is variable, and several of the events have plausible alternative explanations that have nothing to do with regional stress transfer, but roughly, suggestively consistent. This is the very beginning of what some researchers call a chain reaction hypothesis. The idea that a significant earthquake in one part of a linked fault system can initiate a cascade of stress redistribution that progressively loads and eventually triggers events in connected parts of the system. The cascade doesn't happen instantaneously, and it doesn't follow a simple linear path from one fault to the next. It propagates through the network in a way that reflects the geometry of the connections, the loading state of individual faults, and the efficiency with which stress is transmitted through the crust. In a diffuse plate boundary zone like the western United States, where dozens of fault systems are all responding to the same regional stress field, the potential for cascade behavior is real. The critical limitation here is sample size. 2 moderate earthquakes and a handful of small anomalies do not establish a chain reaction. They raise a hypothesis. They motivate monitoring. They give seismologists a specific model to test against incoming data. But they don't prove anything. And this is exactly where the distinction between the scientific approach to this question and the popular media approach tends to diverge most sharply. Science says, here's a hypothesis, here's what we'd need to see to test it, let's watch. Popular media says, chain reaction confirmed, major earthquake imminent. Neither of those responses is correct, but only one of them is useful. What these anomalies actually represent, the most honest framing of what they tell us, is that the regional stress field in the western United States was, during this period, doing something. Something that was nudging multiple fault systems toward elevated activity. Whether that something was a genuine cascade initiated by the Walker Lane event, or whether it was a broader regional adjustment driven by a deeper process that we haven't yet identified, is genuinely unclear. What isn't unclear is that the Pahranagat Shear Zone, sitting at the structural relay junction between the Walker Lane and Eastern California systems, is exactly where you'd expect to see a response if the system is operating as a connected network. And that's precisely where a statistically rare event just occurred. The hidden shear zone system that absorbs so much of the strain along this plate boundary is, in some form, expressing itself. We just don't yet fully understand the language it's speaking. Part 9. The Fault Network Problem. One of the most persistent and frustrating limitations in earthquake science is this. The more realistically you model a fault system, the harder it becomes to forecast what that fault system will do next. This is not because better models are worse models, it's because better models reveal the true complexity of what you're dealing with, and complex systems are fundamentally less predictable than simple ones. The history of earthquake science, in many ways, is a history of discovering that faults are more complicated than we initially thought, and then having to revise our forecasts accordingly. The Pahranagat Shear Zone is a perfect example of this problem. In the simplest model of the system, a single continuous fault strand, moving at a steady rate, accumulating and releasing strain in a regular predictable cycle, you could, in principle, calculate a recurrence interval for moderate events and make probabilistic statements about when the next magnitude 4 to 5 earthquake might occur. This is the conceptual framework behind most seismic hazard assessments. Identify the fault, characterize its geometry and slip rate, calculate the recurrence interval, express the result as an annual probability of exceeding a given shaking threshold. But the Pahranagat Shear Zone isn't a single continuous fault strand. It's a distributed network of multiple strands, the Maynard Lake, the Buckhorn, the Arrowhead Mine, and potentially others that haven't been fully mapped, each of which behaves semi-independently and interacts with the others in ways that are not fully characterized. Research by Joan Gomberg and colleagues on distributed fault network seismicity in the Basin and Range has shown something that fundamentally challenges the simple recurrence interval model. In regions of distributed faulting, the seismicity doesn't concentrate predictably on the largest, most obvious fault strands. Instead, it arises from clusters of smaller faults that interact in complex emergent ways. The locations of individual earthquakes within the network appear nearly random from the surface, even when the underlying driving forces are systematic. This emergent behavior that arises from the interactions between many components rather than from the properties of any single component, is what makes distributed fault systems so difficult to forecast. You can understand each individual fault strand reasonably well. You can measure its geometry, estimate its slip rate, calculate the stress it's accumulating. But the behavior of the network as a whole, which strand will slip first, when the slip will happen, how large the event will be, emerges from the interactions between all the strands together. And those interactions are sensitive to initial conditions in a way that makes long-term, specific forecasting essentially impossible with current technology. Here's a useful way to think about this. Consider a complex web of wires, all under varying amounts of tension. You can measure the tension in each individual wire, but the question of which wire will snap first, or more importantly, whether a snap in one wire will immediately propagate to others, depends on the exact spatial configuration of the web, the exact relative tensions and small perturbations that might not be measurable in advance. The web behaves as a system, not as a collection of independent wires, and changing one wire changes the behavior of the whole system. Fault networks work similarly. The Pahranagat Shear Zone, with its multiple strands all responding to the same regional stress field and all capable of transferring stress to each other, is a web of this kind. The magnitude 4.7 that just occurred was the snapping of one part of the web, which means the tensions in all the other parts have now changed. Not dramatically. The energy released in a single magnitude 4.7 is small relative to the total strain energy stored in a regional fault system, but changed. The system is not in the same state it was before the earthquake, and the next event, whenever it comes, will emerge from the new state rather than the old one. The deeper implication of the fault network problem, the one that connects back to our central question about the hidden shear zone system and what it's telling us, is that we may be systematically underestimating the connectivity of these networks. When individual moderate events appear on the seismicity map, widely separated in space and time, the natural human tendency is to treat them as independent events, random background seismicity, normal behavior for an active region. The fault network problem tells us that this intuition is likely wrong. Moderate events that appear disconnected at the surface may be responding to the same deep stress changes. They may be nodes in the same network, lighting up in sequence as a stress redistribution pulse propagates through the system. And that's not a theoretical abstraction. That's exactly the observational picture we're looking at right now. A Walker Lane event followed 2 weeks later by a Pahranagat event, accompanied by anomalous small events elsewhere in the region, on a collection of fault systems that the geological evidence suggests are structurally connected. The fault network isn't just a model, it's a description of what the data is showing us. And earthquakes don't just release stress, they move it, they redistribute it across the network. And the redistribution is what happens next. Part 10. The Energy Redistribution Model. There is a common but deeply mistaken assumption about earthquakes and the energy they release. The assumption is that an earthquake represents the resolution of a stress problem. that the fault slips, the stress is relieved, and the system returns to a lower energy state that takes decades or centuries to reload. In this model, an earthquake is the end of a story, the conclusion, the place where the tension resolves. But that's not how stress redistribution actually works in a fault network. A more accurate model, and one that is broadly supported by both theoretical mechanics and observational seismology, is that earthquakes are not endpoints, they are redistribution events. When a fault slips, it does release stress on the specific patch of fault that ruptured. But that stress doesn't disappear, it moves. It gets redistributed into the surrounding crust, loading adjacent faults, advancing or retarding their progress toward failure, changing the stress state of the entire network in a way that unfolds over timescales ranging from seconds to decades. The formal framework for quantifying this redistribution is called Coulomb stress transfer. The basic idea is straightforward. When a fault ruptures, the deformation of the surrounding rock changes the balance of normal stress and shear stress on every other fault surface in the vicinity. For some faults, this change moves them closer to failure. The Coulomb failure stress on those faults increases. For others, the change moves them away from failure. Their Coulomb failure stress decreases. By calculating the stress tensor change from a rupture and projecting it onto receiver fault geometries, you can make probabilistic statements about which faults became more or less likely to produce earthquakes as a result of the event. Applied to the April 14th Walker Lane magnitude 5.7 and the April 29th Pahranagat magnitude 4.7, Coulomb stress analysis provides a physical framework for testing the trigger hypothesis. If the Pahranagat fault strands that ruptured experienced a positive Coulomb stress change from the Silver Springs event, if they were in the stress loading zone rather than the stress shadow, then the stress redistribution from the Walker Lane earthquake genuinely advanced the timing of the Pahranagat event. It pulled the trigger forward. Not by creating the earthquake from nothing, but by providing the final increment of stress needed to push a fault that was already loaded past its failure threshold. This is what seismologists mean when they talk about a sequence. Not a collection of random, unrelated events that happen to occur in the same region over a short time period. A sequence is a physically connected series of events in which each earthquake redistributes stress in ways that influence the probability and timing of subsequent earthquakes. The most familiar kind of sequence is an aftershock sequence, the cloud of smaller events that follows a large earthquake, driven by the static stress changes from the main shock. But sequences can also work between different fault systems, mediated by the regional stress field, playing out over weeks to months rather than hours to days. The April 2025 sequence in the Walker Lane and Southern Great Basin, if it is a sequence, would represent exactly this kind of cross-fault, multi-system stress propagation. The Walker Lane event redistributes stress across the broader regional network. The Pahranagat Shear Zone, sitting at the structural relay junction between the Walker Lane and the Eastern California Shear Zone, responds 2 weeks later. The stress redistribution from the Pahranagat event then changes the loading state of other faults in its vicinity, some moving closer to failure, some moving away. And here is the part that matters most for thinking about what comes next. The Pahranagat magnitude 4.7 may be a mid-sequence event rather than a terminal one. If the Walker Lane magnitude 5.7 initiated a regional stress redistribution pulse, if it loaded multiple faults across a several hundred-kilometre arc of the diffuse plate boundary, then the Pahranagat event was one response, not the only response. Other faults in the network that received stress loading from the original Walker Lane rupture may still be working toward their own responses, on their own timescales, in their own ways, without forewarning. This is where uncertainty becomes genuinely consequential rather than just intellectually interesting. The stress redistribution from the Walker Lane event is not something that resolves cleanly in a few weeks and leaves the system at rest. It propagates, it evolves, it interacts with the stress redistribution from the Pahranagat event. The system that exists today, in the days and weeks after both events, is a different system from the one that existed on April 13th, and we don't have a complete enough picture of the network's connectivity and loading state to say with confidence where the next response will occur, or when. Energy doesn't disappear, it relocates, and that relocation, right now, is ongoing. This is where the real story gets muddied by speculation, where the genuine scientific uncertainty gets filled in by narratives that are more satisfying than the truth, but considerably less useful. because when the science is unclear, the theories rush in and they need to be addressed. Part 11. The Nuclear Test Site Question. 928. Let that number stand for a moment before we proceed. 928 nuclear detonations, most of them underground, in a piece of seismically active crust in the Nevada desert, between 1951 and 1992. The energy released by the largest of these tests, the Kanakin test on Amchitka Island in 1971, which while not in Nevada represents the scale of what nuclear underground testing can do, was equivalent to 5 megatons of TNT. The tests at the Nevada site were generally smaller, but the cumulative energy delivered to the Nevada crust over 4 decades of testing was enormous by any standard. The monitoring apparatus that now watches for nuclear tests globally is called the International Monitoring System, operated by the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. It consists of 337 facilities around the world, including seismographic stations, infrasound arrays, hydroacoustic sensors, and radionuclide detectors. The seismographic component alone can detect underground explosions equivalent to approximately 1 kiloton of TNT anywhere in the world. A device of that size, if detonated underground in Nevada, would produce a distinctive seismic signature that is qualitatively different from a tectonic earthquake. Sharper initial wave onsets, different frequency content, specific ratios between wave types, and it would be detected within minutes by multiple stations of the global network. No such detection was made in connection with the Pahranagat Shear Zone earthquake. Furthermore, the waveform character of the April 29th Nevada earthquake is consistent in all measurable respects with a tectonic fault rupture. The initial wave onset is appropriately emergent. The frequency content matches what you'd expect from shear faulting in basin and range crust at the reported depth. The source mechanism, the pattern of compressional and dilatational first motions at seismograph stations around the epicenter, is consistent with left lateral strike-slip faulting on a plane oriented in the direction of the Pahranagat Shear Zone. This is not an explosion. The geophysics is unambiguous on that point, but here's the question that the scientific literature actually does leave open, and that deserves a more careful treatment than it usually gets. The cumulative effect of 928 underground explosions on the long-term stress state of the Nevada crust. Not the immediate triggering of earthquakes by individual tests. That phenomenon has been studied, is reasonably well understood, and was real. But the decades-long legacy effect of having delivered massive amounts of energy into a piece of crust that is also part of an active seismic system. How does the stress field of the Nevada crust in 2025 differ from what it would have been if the tests had never occurred? The honest answer is that we don't have a definitive measurement of that difference. The theoretical arguments for a significant long-term legacy are limited and speculative, but the absence of a definitive measurement is not the same as proof of no effect. The research literature on induced seismicity, earthquakes triggered by human activities, is extensive and growing. Oil and gas wastewater injection has triggered earthquakes at significant distances from injection wells. Reservoir impoundment has triggered earthquakes beneath large dams. Deep geothermal drilling has triggered earthquakes at depths comparable to tectonic events. The mechanisms are real, the scales are real, and the legacy timescales can be longer than the activities themselves. In that scientific context, the question of whether 4 decades of underground nuclear testing left a measurable imprint on the stress state of Nevada crust is not a conspiracy theory. It's a legitimate scientific question that hasn't been fully answered. What shifts the focus back to natural tectonics, and this is the crucial reframe, is that you don't need anything beyond natural tectonics to explain this earthquake. The Pahranagat Shear Zone was going to produce magnitude 4 to 5 earthquakes, regardless of the test site. It's been doing it for millions of years. The regional stress field driving the fault is the result of continental plate boundary processes that operate on timescales and at energy levels that dwarf anything human activity has ever generated. The earthquake that just occurred fits neatly within the expected behavior of a principal earthquake-producing fault system that absorbs a significant fraction of plate boundary strain. The test site question is contextual complexity, not causation, and the real causal story, the one that tells you something genuinely important about how this planet works, is in the natural mechanics of the fault network. Which brings us to what the science actually says. Part 12. What the science actually says. The scientific literature on seismicity in the southern Great Basin and the Pahranagat Shear Zone region is more nuanced and more honest about its own limitations than almost any popular account of this earthquake has been willing to acknowledge. Reading the peer-reviewed literature on this topic, particularly the papers from the United States Geological Survey and the research published in the Journal of Geophysical Research over the past 3 decades, reveals a consistent pattern. The science knows a great deal about this region. It also explicitly acknowledges, in its own careful language, what it doesn't know. The USGS characterization of the Pahranagat Shear Zone as one of the principal earthquake-producing structures in the southern Great Basin is not just a bureaucratic designation, it's a summary of decades of observational evidence. The fault system has produced documented seismicity across multiple time periods. The offset features in the landscape tell a story of repeated slip-over geological time. The instrumental record shows ongoing background seismicity that is consistent with a fault system actively accumulating and releasing strain. All of this is consistent with the regional stress models for the diffuse plate boundary zone, the models that predict ongoing moderate seismicity distributed across the Walker Lane, the central Nevada seismic belt, and the southern Great Basin as the crust accommodates the fraction of plate boundary motion that bypasses the San Andreas. Studies of the broader region have found that the pattern of seismicity is generally consistent with the predicted strain distribution from geodetic models. GPS measurements of crustal deformation in the western United States show that the ground is moving in measurable, precise, millimeter-per-year amounts in ways that map onto the strain that the fault systems are expected to be absorbing. The Walker Lane system is moving. The Eastern California Shear Zone is moving. And in between, the structures of the southern Great Basin, including the Pahranagat, are accommodating their share of the motion. But here's where the science explicitly stops short of certainty, and where the language in the papers shifts from declarative to conditional. The precise connectivity between the fault systems of the southern Great Basin, how stress transfers between them, on what timescales through what mechanisms, remains incompletely resolved. Specific papers on the topic use phrases like extent remains unclear, and the degree of mechanical coupling between adjacent systems is not well constrained. These are not throwaway qualifications. In scientific writing, they represent a genuine acknowledgement that the models don't yet capture the full picture. One of the most interesting findings in the literature relates to an area near the Nevada National Security Site, specifically the region around Yucca Mountain, which was the site of an extensive seismic hazard assessment conducted in connection with the proposed nuclear waste repository. The studies found that the seismicity pattern in that region does not fully match what the strain models would predict. There are zones where the models expect seismicity but find relative quiet. There are other zones where the models expect quiet but find activity. The mismatch is not large enough to overturn the fundamental picture, but it's large enough to suggest that the models are missing something, some interaction, some structural feature, some stress pathway that hasn't been fully characterized. That something is the honest position of the science, not a conspiracy, not a gap deliberately hidden from the public, just the frontier of knowledge, the place where the evidence runs out and the questions begin. And it's at that frontier that the significance of the Pahranagat earthquake lives. Not in its damage potential, which was minimal, not in its proximity to sensitive facilities, which is contextual, but in what it tells us about a system that is still, after decades of intensive study, surprising the people who study it most carefully. The real question isn't what caused this earthquake. Natural tectonics caused this earthquake. The real question is what this earthquake reveals about how the system works, and that question leads us into territory where the science is genuinely uncertain, genuinely important, and genuinely under-discussed. Part 13. The Induced Seismicity Edge Case. Induced seismicity is one of the more contentious topics in applied geophysics, not because the phenomenon is scientifically controversial. It isn't, it's extremely well documented. But because its implications for industry, infrastructure, and policy make it politically and economically sensitive. The basic science is this: human activities that alter the stress state of the crust, through fluid injection, fluid extraction, mass loading, or the introduction of large amounts of energy, can trigger earthquakes, not always, not everywhere. But under the right geological conditions, with the right pre-existing fault population and stress state, human activities can push faults from below their failure threshold to above it. The clearest modern examples involve wastewater injection from oil and gas operations. The dramatic increase in seismicity in Oklahoma and southern Kansas during the 2010s has been definitively linked to the injection of oil and gas wastewater into deep disposal wells. Areas that had historically recorded almost no seismicity were producing multiple magnitude 4 and 5 earthquakes per year at the peak of injection activity. The mechanism is well understood. Injecting fluid into the subsurface reduces the normal stress on fault surfaces by increasing pore pressure, effectively lubricating faults that were otherwise stable. This is not a contested scientific claim. It's one of the most well-studied geophysical phenomena of the past 2 decades. The connection to underground nuclear testing is conceptually different, but mechanically analogous in some ways. Underground nuclear detonations are not fluid injection events. The energy release mechanism is entirely different, but they do deliver enormous amounts of energy to the subsurface. They do create permanent deformation of the surrounding rock, and they can affect pore pressure in the crust through both the mechanical disruption of rock fabric and the vaporization and subsequent condensation of groundwater. The question is whether these effects, individually modest for any single test, but potentially cumulative across 928 tests over 4 decades, have contributed to an altered stress state in the Nevada crust that persists to the present day. The honest scientific answer is that we don't know. The legacy stress effects of underground nuclear testing in the Nevada crust have not been systematically characterized. The monitoring networks in the region were established primarily to detect and characterize ongoing natural seismicity, and to verify treaty compliance, not to measure the residual stress perturbations from historical tests. The data needed to answer this question definitively, a comprehensive before and after stress field measurement for the Nevada crust, taken before and after the testing era, simply doesn't exist. What does exist is theoretical modelling of the stress effects of underground nuclear explosions and some empirical observations of triggered seismicity in the immediate aftermath of tests. These studies show that individual large underground tests did trigger seismicity in the surrounding region in the hours and days after detonation, clear evidence that tests affected the local stress field in the short term. Whether those effects accumulated over decades in a way that altered the long-term background stress state is a much harder question, and one that hasn't been definitively answered. Here's what the evidence does and doesn't support. It supports the possibility that the Nevada crust in the vicinity of the test site has a stress state that is, to some small and perhaps unquantifiable degree, different from what it would have been without the testing program. It does not support the conclusion that this difference is the primary driver of the earthquake activity we're discussing. The regional tectonic driving forces are vastly larger, in spatial scale, in energy, and in their long-term influence on fault behaviour, than anything the testing program could have produced. The Pahranagat Shear Zone was a principal earthquake-producing structure before the first test was ever detonated at the Nevada test site. It will continue to be one long after the legacy effects of those tests, whatever they are, have faded into the background. Complexity is not conspiracy. That's the sentence that should anchor everything in this section. The unresolved questions about the long-term stress legacy of underground nuclear testing are real. The scientific uncertainty around the precise mechanical connectivity of the southern Great Basin fault systems is real. The gap between what we observe and what our models fully predict is real. None of these uncertainties require a non-natural explanation. They require better science, which is a much less satisfying conclusion than a cover-up, but it's the one that corresponds to reality. Part 14. Debunking the noise. Let's take a few minutes to clear the air because any earthquake near the Nevada test site generates a predictable cloud of alternative theories, and letting those theories stand unchallenged does disservice to the genuinely interesting natural story. Covert nuclear test. The seismographic evidence refutes this completely. The waveform characteristics of this earthquake, the specific pattern of seismic wave types, their relative amplitudes, their frequency content, the source mechanism derived from first motion analysis, are inconsistent with an underground explosion and consistent with tectonic fault rupture. These signatures are well understood and reliably distinguishable. Furthermore, an underground nuclear detonation powerful enough to produce the shaking that was felt in Las Vegas would be instantaneously detected by dozens of stations of the International Monitoring System. There was no such detection. Subcritical nuclear trigger, the idea that a small, sub-yield nuclear experiment was used to deliberately trigger or amplify a natural earthquake. The energy arithmetic alone eliminates this. A subcritical experiment, by definition, doesn't achieve nuclear yield. The maximum energy from a subcritical experiment is orders of magnitude smaller than the energy released by a magnitude 4.7 tectonic earthquake. You cannot use a smaller energy source to reliably trigger a larger one on demand. The fault was either going to rupture or it wasn't, based on its accumulated stress state, and no human technology currently exists to reliably force that decision. HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Alaska, which is a legitimate ionospheric research facility that generates electromagnetic waves to study the upper atmosphere. HAARP has become a catch-all explanation for any geophysical event that doesn't have an immediately obvious cause in popular online communities. The mechanism by which ionospheric heating could trigger a fault rupture at crustal depths in Nevada is not physically coherent. Electromagnetic waves of the frequencies and power levels produced by HAARP do not penetrate to the depths where tectonic earthquakes nucleate. The coupling between ionospheric perturbations and deep crustal stress is unmeasurably small. HAARP cannot trigger earthquakes. Full stop. These theories persist not because they are persuasive to anyone who examines the evidence carefully, but because they offer the psychological comfort of a human agent, someone to blame, something to demand accountability for, in the face of a natural process that is genuinely complex and genuinely uncertain. The crust of the Earth moves according to physics that doesn't require anyone's permission and doesn't respond to anyone's agenda. That's more unsettling than a conspiracy, not less, and it's the truth. The real mystery here is not who triggered this earthquake. The real mystery is how a natural system that absorbs a significant fraction of the strain along a continental plate boundary actually works, how stress moves through it, how it decides when and where to release, how we can better characterize its behavior to improve our understanding of seismic hazard in the region. That's the mystery worth pursuing, and it's the one that takes us back to where we started. Part 15. The Real Mystery Reframe. Step back from the individual details, the magnitude, the depth, the proximity to the test site, the timing, the alternative theories, and ask the most fundamental question available. What is actually unknown here? Not what people are speculating about, not what conspiracy theories are claiming. What does the scientific literature explicitly identify as unresolved about this region and this fault system? The answer is this. The way stress moves through the linked shear zone system of the Southern Great Basin, through the Walker Lane, through the Pahranagat, through the Eastern California Shear Zone, and between those systems, is not fully understood. The individual components are reasonably well characterized. The regional stress field is reasonably well constrained. The geodetic data provides a good first-order picture of how the crust is deforming. But the mechanics of how stress transfers between the components, on what timescales, through what pathways, and with what consequences for the timing and location of future earthquakes, that remains an open question. Not a vague, hand-wavy kind of open question, a specific, technically defined, actively researched open question that appears explicitly as such in peer-reviewed publications. And here's why that matters more than anything else in this story. The Southern Great Basin, the Walker Lane, and the Eastern California Shear Zone together accommodate 20 to 25% of the relative motion between the Pacific and North American plates. That's not a trivial fraction. That's hundreds of millions of people living in the western United States whose seismic hazard is partly determined by a system that we acknowledge we don't fully understand. The moderate earthquakes that this system produces, the magnitude 4 to 5 events that seem minor compared to a Great Plate boundary earthquake, are the visible surface expression of deep mechanical processes that are continuously operating, continuously redistributing strain, continuously loading and unloading the fault strands that could eventually produce something much larger. The Pahranagat Shear Zone earthquake of April 2025 is not significant because of its size. It's significant because it's one of those rare moments when a piece of the hidden system does something observable, something measurable, something that made it briefly into the news cycle, and gives us a window into how the system is behaving right now. Every moderate earthquake on a principal fault system in the diffuse plate boundary zone is a data point, a small piece of information about the state of stress in the network, about how that stress is evolving, about where the system is in its long, slow, continuous process of absorbing and releasing the strain that the plates are relentlessly delivering. We understand pieces of this. We understand the individual faults reasonably well. We understand the broad regional stress field. We understand the kinematics of the plate boundary well enough to make first-order seismic hazard assessments, but we don't understand the whole system. We don't understand how it behaves as a network, and until we do, every significant event in this region is an opportunity, a chance to learn something new about a system that quietly does some of the most consequential tectonic work on the entire North American continent. And what happens next matters more than what just happened, which is exactly why we need to talk about what to watch for in the weeks and months ahead. Part 16. The Regional Pulse Theory. There's a hypothesis, and it's important to call it what it is, a hypothesis, not a conclusion, not a prediction, not a warning, that what we're observing in the Walker Lane and Southern Great Basin right now represents a regional pulse, a period of elevated, interconnected activity across the linked shear zone system that's driven by a temporary increase in the rate of stress redistribution through the fault network, not a random collection of unrelated events, but a coherent, physically connected sequence of responses to a stress state that has been perturbed by one or more significant ruptures in the system. The regional pulse hypothesis goes like this. The April 14th Walker Lane magnitude 5.7 was not just a local event. It was a significant perturbation to the regional stress field, large enough to deliver measurable Coulomb stress changes to fault systems across a several hundred-kilometre radius. Those stress changes didn't propagate instantaneously to produce synchronized earthquakes everywhere at once. They propagated through the network at rates determined by the mechanical properties of the crust, the geometry of the fault connections, and the loading state of individual fault segments. Different parts of the network responded at different times, producing a temporal sequence of events, the Pahranagat magnitude 4.7 2 weeks later, the smaller anomalies elsewhere in the region, that reflects the progressive ripple of stress redistribution through the system. The structural geometry supports this hypothesis. The Walker Lane runs roughly north-northwest through western Nevada, channeling right lateral shear strain from the diffuse plate boundary. The Pahranagat Shear Zone runs east-northeast from its intersection with the Walker Lane, transferring strain into the southern Great Basin. The Eastern California Shear Zone connects to the southern end of the Pahranagat region and continues into the Mojave Desert. These three systems form a rough triangular network, with the Pahranagat at one of the connection points. A stress change in the Walker Lane, the northern arm of the triangle, could propagate through the Pahranagat connection into the Eastern California arm. The geometry is consistent with a relay. What makes the hypothesis mechanically plausible rather than merely geometrically suggestive is the existing literature on stress transfer in connected fault systems. There are well-documented historical sequences in which a significant earthquake in one part of a regional fault network has been followed over weeks to months by elevated activity in connected parts of the network, activity that is statistically above background and spatially consistent with the stress redistribution from the initial event. The mechanisms are understood in principle: static stress transfer, post-seismic relaxation, dynamic triggering. The question for any specific sequence is always whether the data is good enough, the sample size is large enough, and the alternative explanations have been adequately tested. For the April 2025 Walker Lane Pahranagat sequence, the hypothesis is supported by the timing, the structural geometry, and the statistical rarity of the Pahranagat event. It is not yet proven by those observations alone. Proof would require a detailed Coulomb stress analysis using precise fault geometries for both events, comparison of the predicted stress loading zones with the actual distribution of seismicity in the weeks following the Walker Lane event, and ideally some geodetic evidence from GPS or INSAR satellite data of the deformation pattern consistent with the proposed stress redistribution pathway. None of that analysis has been published at the time of this video, which means the regional pulse hypothesis is, right now, an inference from available observations, a scientifically motivated and structurally grounded inference, but an inference nonetheless. It could be confirmed by subsequent data. It could also be refuted. The Walker Lane and Pahranagat events could turn out to be independent, with the temporal correlation being coincidental rather than causal. The system could return to background seismicity levels and stay there, producing no further anomalous events, which would weaken rather than support the cascade hypothesis. We won't know from this earthquake alone, but the fact that we're asking this question, the fact that the data motivates the hypothesis, is itself significant. It means that the linked shear zone system of the western United States is doing something that at least one of its well-instrumented principal fault systems is responding to visibly. And visible responses are how science learns, which is why what happens next deserves close attention. Part 17. What to watch next. If you want to understand what this earthquake is actually telling us, not in the shallow news cycle sense, but in the deeper sense of what the tectonic system is doing, then the data to watch over the coming weeks and months falls into several categories, each of which offers a different window into the system's behaviour. The first and most immediate thing to watch is the aftershock sequence, or the lack of one. Major earthquakes produce aftershocks, smaller events that occur in the same region as the main shock, driven by the stress redistribution from the main rupture, typically decaying in frequency over time according to a well-characterized statistical relationship known as Amori's law. A magnitude 4.7 should produce a small but detectable aftershock sequence, a handful of magnitude 2 to 3 events in the days following the main shock, probably nothing larger. If the aftershock sequence is larger than expected, or if it extends over a broader geographic area than typical for an event of this size, that would be worth noting. If the region goes quiet immediately after the main shock, quieter than background, that could indicate that the main shock released most of the locally accumulated stress and the fault system is in a temporary shadow. Both patterns carry information. The second thing to watch is the migration of seismicity in the region surrounding the Pahranagat Shear Zone. After a significant event on a distributed fault system, it's not unusual to see seismicity activate on adjacent fault strands that weren't obviously involved in the initial rupture. The stress redistribution from the main shock loads neighbouring parts of the fault network, and in the days to weeks following a moderate earthquake, you sometimes see a spatial diffusion of seismicity outward from the epicenter, small events appearing progressively farther from the original rupture as the stress pulse propagates through the network. If that spatial migration is coherent and directional, if the seismicity moves preferentially toward the southeast, in the direction of the Eastern California shear zone, for example, that would be consistent with the stress propagating along the inferred structural linkage. The third data stream to watch is GPS deformation monitoring. The network of continuously operating GPS receivers in the western United States, operated by the Plate Boundary Observatory and various university and agency networks, measures crustal deformation with millimeter precision at daily to weekly timescales. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake should produce measurable static deformation on GPS stations within roughly 50 kilometers of the epicenter. But more interesting would be any anomalous deformation signal at greater distances, any evidence of strain accumulation or release in the connected fault systems that exceeds what the background models predict. This kind of signal could indicate that the stress redistribution from the Pahranagat event is loading other parts of the network. INSAR, interferometric synthetic aperture radar, is a satellite-based technique that measures ground deformation by comparing radar images of the same patch of ground taken at different times. It provides a spatially continuous picture of surface deformation across areas hundreds of kilometers wide with centimeter to millimeter precision. The Sentinel-1 satellites operated by the European Space Agency provide routine coverage of the western United States with repeat passes every 12 days. An INSAR analysis of the Pahranagat region should be able to detect the Kosi-Ismic deformation from the magnitude 4.7, the permanent ground displacement associated with the fault slip. If there's any evidence of distributed deformation across a broader area than expected for the fault length of a magnitude 4.7, that would suggest the slip involved multiple strands of the shear zone and might have loaded adjacent structures more significantly than a simple single-strand model would predict. The data over the next several months is critical to evaluating the regional pulse hypothesis. Earthquakes don't follow headlines, they follow physics. The stress redistribution from the Walker Lane event is playing out on timescales that don't care about news cycles. If the cascade hypothesis is correct, the responses will keep coming. Not necessarily dramatically, not necessarily on any human-preferred schedule, but steadily as the stress pulse works its way through the network. If the system returns to background seismicity without further anomalous events, the hypothesis is weakened. Either way, the data will be more informative than any amount of speculation, and the data needs time to accumulate. Which brings us to the variable in this story that nobody talks about enough. Part 18. The silent variable, time. Human beings are poorly calibrated for geological timescales. We talk about earthquakes as events, discrete things that happen on specific dates and then are over. We treat seismic sequences as stories with beginnings and endings, climaxes and resolutions. We expect the plot to resolve in a time frame we can follow, and this expectation, reasonable as it is from a human perspective, fundamentally distorts our ability to understand what tectonic systems are actually doing. Consider the historical examples of extended seismic sequences in the western United States. The Central Nevada Seismic Belt, a roughly linear zone of fault systems running north-northwest through central Nevada, produced a remarkable series of major earthquakes in the 20th century that illustrates this point vividly. The 1915 Pleasant Valley earthquake, magnitude 7.3. The 1932 Cedar Mountain earthquake, magnitude 7.2. The 1954 Dixie Valley and Fairview Peak earthquakes, both in the magnitude 7 range, occurring within minutes of each other on adjacent faults. These events are spread across 4 decades. They are separated by 22 years of apparent quiet between major ruptures, and yet they represent a coherent sequence, a progressive transfer of strain from one part of the Central Nevada seismic belt to adjacent parts, each large event loading the next segment toward failure. Decades, not days, not months. The timescale on which stress redistribution plays out in continental fault systems can span decades. And this is the variable that makes earthquake science so genuinely difficult, not just technically, but epistemically. When you're waiting for confirmation of a hypothesis that might take 20 years to arrive, you're operating at the limits of human institutional memory. Funding cycles, career timescales, attention spans, none of these are calibrated to 20-year confirmation windows. The implication for the current Walker Lane, Pahranagat sequence is that we are very likely in the early stages of whatever story this sequence is going to tell. If the regional pulse hypothesis is correct, if the Walker Lane event did initiate a period of elevated stress redistribution across the linked shear zone system, the full expression of that redistribution may take months to years to manifest. Some of the stress changes delivered by the Walker Lane event to more distant parts of the fault network may not produce observable seismicity for months, depending on how close to failure those faults were when the perturbation arrived. The system is adjusting. The adjustment will proceed at the pace dictated by the physics of crustal deformation and fault mechanics, not at the pace that would be convenient for news coverage. This time variable also affects how we interpret the current quiet. In the days following the Pahranagat magnitude 4.7, the region has been producing its expected small aftershock sequence and otherwise returning to background seismicity levels. Some observers would take this as evidence that the sequence is over, that the stress was released, the system relaxed, nothing more is coming. But a geologist who has read the Central Nevada seismic belt literature knows that extended quiet between events in a sequence is normal. The absence of immediate follow-on activity is not evidence that the stress redistribution is complete. It's just evidence that no fault in the network has been pushed past its failure threshold today. The stress is still there. It's still redistributing. The system is still evolving. And understanding that evolution requires watching not just the next few days, but the next few years. Which is why this earthquake, statistically rare, structurally significant, temporally interesting, deserves the kind of sustained scientific attention that a brief news cycle can never provide. Because the real story is the behaviour of a system over time, not the behaviour of a fault on a single Tuesday afternoon. Part 19. Why this matters more than it looks. Let's be honest about why this story gets downplayed. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake in the Nevada desert, with no casualties, no damage, no dramatic footage of crumbling buildings. That's not, by the conventional metrics of news value, a significant event. News coverage of earthquakes scales almost entirely with the destruction they cause. The larger the death toll, the longer the story. The smaller the damage, the shorter the mention, which means that the earthquakes that matter most for understanding tectonic systems, the moderate events that reveal the mechanics of how strain accumulates and releases across fault networks, are systematically underreported relative to their scientific significance. The Pahranagat Shear Zone earthquake matters not because of what it destroyed. It matters because of what it reveals. And what it reveals is a window into the behaviour of a tectonic system that is doing real, consequential work, absorbing 20 to 25% of the relative motion between two of Earth's largest tectonic plates, in a way that is still not fully understood. The moderate events are the diagnostic signal. They're the heartbeat of the system, telling anyone who's listening something about the state of stress, the distribution of loading, and the progressive evolution of a fault network that is continuously responding to the relentless delivery of plate boundary strain. The seismic hazard implications of this are real and non-trivial. The western United States is home to tens of millions of people living in the region affected by the diffuse plate boundary zone. The cities of Las Vegas, Reno, Sacramento, and the entire Los Angeles metropolitan area all sit within or adjacent to the zone of distributed deformation. Current seismic hazard models for these regions are based on fault catalogues and strain rate estimates that are as complete as the existing literature allows. But as complete as the existing literature allows isn't the same as complete. The gaps in our understanding of how stress transfers between linked fault systems, the gaps that the Pahranagat earthquake and its timing are highlighting, represent real uncertainties in the hazard assessments that affect building codes, insurance rates, infrastructure design standards, and emergency management planning across the entire region. The hidden systems matter. The faults that don't produce dramatic great earthquakes with dramatic news coverage, the distributed networks of moderate magnitude structures like the Pahranagat Shear Zone that quietly absorb strain and occasionally remind us they exist with events like this one, these are the systems that govern the background seismic risk for millions of people. Understanding them better isn't just academically interesting, it's practically important. It's the kind of scientific knowledge that, when it's complete enough, translates directly into better hazard models, better designed buildings, better prepared emergency services, and ultimately fewer casualties when the system produces its inevitable larger events. And here's the broader scientific point that this earthquake, this timing, and this location are collectively making. The western United States is not a simple plate boundary, with one well-understood fault and a collection of secondary structures. It's a complex, distributed, mechanically interconnected deformation zone, in which the full story of how strain accumulates and releases is still being written. Every significant event in this system, every magnitude 4 to 5 earthquake on a named principal fault structure, is a page of that story, a data point that scientists can use to test models, refine hazard assessments, and move incrementally toward a more complete understanding of how this part of the planet actually works. The magnitude 4.7 on the Pahranagat Shear Zone is not an anomaly to be explained away. It's a signal to be understood, a window into the mechanics of a system that matters enormously to the people who live in its reach. And windows, by their nature, don't stay open forever. The data window that this earthquake has opened, the opportunity to study the aftershock sequence, the stress redistribution, the geodetic response, the relationship to the Walker Lane event, that window is open right now. The scientists who are watching it have a finite amount of time to collect the most informative observations before the signal fades back into the background noise. This is a window, not an endpoint, and what you see through a window depends entirely on whether you're willing to look. Part 20. Closing the loop. We started with a detail, a small, easy-to-miss detail buried in the wire copy about a minor earthquake in the Nevada desert. A magnitude 4.7, no damage, no casualties, brief mention, move on. And the detail was this. The epicenter wasn't just anywhere in the Nevada desert. It was on the Pahranagat Shear Zone, one of the principal earthquake-producing structures in the southern Great Basin. A fault system that the USGS has formally identified as structurally significant, geophysically important, and, in the context of the wider diffuse plate boundary zone of the American West, part of a network that quietly absorbs a staggering fraction of the strain generated at the edge of the North American continent. Everything that followed from that detail was always implicit in it. The geometry of the fault network, not a single crack but a braid of strands, the Maynard Lake, the Buckhorn, the Arrowhead Mine, each one semi-independent, each one talking to the others in a language made of stress and pressure and incremental deformation. The statistical rarity of a magnitude 4.7 on this specific structure, a jump of roughly 5,000 times the energy of the previous month's largest event, with no obvious foreshock sequence, no gradual escalation, just background noise and then suddenly this. The depth uncertainty and its implications for shaking intensity at distance, a focal depth that might be 13 kilometers or might be closer to 6, a difference that changes the entire character of how energy reaches the surface. The proximity to one of the most consequential pieces of land in the history of American nuclear testing, 30 miles from a site where 928 devices were detonated into the Nevada crust over 4 decades. And the timing, exactly 14 days after a magnitude 5.7 in the Walker Lane, in the same regional tectonic framework, in the same interconnected shear zone system, in the same hidden architecture that most earthquake coverage never bothers to describe. And underneath all of it, the central question that this story was always about. Not what caused this earthquake. Natural tectonics caused this earthquake, as natural tectonics has been causing earthquakes in this region for millions of years before any human being was around to notice. The central question is what this earthquake reveals, what it tells us about how the system works, what it adds to our understanding of a distributed plate boundary zone that is still, after decades of intensive scientific study, surprising the people who study it most carefully. Because surprise in science is not an embarrassment, it's a signal. It means the models aren't complete yet. It means there's more to learn, and there is always more to learn about a system this complex, operating on timescales this long, across distances this wide. Here is what we know. The Pahranagat Shear Zone is a real, active, structurally significant fault system in a region that is absorbing real, ongoing, significant plate boundary strain. Magnitude 4.7 events on this structure are rare in the modern instrumental record, not unprecedented in the geological sense, but uncommon enough in the era of precise seismic monitoring that this event ranks near the upper bound of what we have directly observed on this fault. The event occurred in a temporal context, 2 weeks after the Walker Lane magnitude 5.7, that is at minimum consistent with, and possibly causally related to, a regional stress redistribution pulse propagating through the linked shear zone system. The shaking from this event was felt 95 kilometers away in Las Vegas, consistent with the physical properties of the crust and the depth of the rupture, consistent with the high quality factor of basin and range crust and the amplification properties of tall structures built on thick sedimentary fill. No alternative explanation. Nuclear test, artificial trigger, exotic electromagnetic technology is supported by a shred of physical evidence, and all of them are refuted by the waveform data, which tells the clear, unambiguous story of a tectonic fault rupture and nothing else. Here is what we don't know. Whether the Walker Lane event triggered the Pahranagat event, or whether the temporal coincidence is exactly that. A coincidence that happens to look meaningful, because the human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns and extraordinarily bad at knowing when to stop. Whether this sequence represents an early stage of a regional stress redistribution pulse that will produce further anomalous events across the linked fault network over the coming months, or whether the system will return quietly to background seismicity and stay there, producing nothing further, leaving the Walker Lane and Pahranagat events as an interesting but ultimately isolated pair. Whether the Pahranagat Shear Zone's structural linkage to the Eastern California Shear Zone is mechanically significant enough, and currently loaded enough, to relay the stress perturbation southward into the Mojave Desert Fault Network, into a region that sits closer to tens of millions of people and carries its own catalogue of significant seismic hazard. Whether the existing seismic hazard assessments for southern Nevada and the greater Las Vegas region adequately capture the potential for this kind of linked, multi-system behaviour, or whether they're based on fault models that treat the Pahranagat, the Walker Lane, and the Eastern California Shear Zone as more independent than the geology actually warrants. We don't know any of those things with certainty, not yet. And here is the honest, uncomfortable, genuinely important truth about what the scientific literature says about the broader system. It says, the extent of the mechanical coupling between the fault systems of the Southern Great Basin, the Walker Lane, and the Eastern California Shear Zone remains unclear. It says, the distribution of seismicity in this region does not fully match the predictions of existing strain models. It says, There are open questions about how stress transfers through this network on timescales longer than a single seismic sequence, about how post-seismic relaxation propagates through connected fault systems, about whether the moderate events we observe are independent releases or nodes in a larger cascade. These are not bureaucratic qualifications inserted by cautious lawyers into otherwise confident scientific papers. They are honest acknowledgements of the frontier of knowledge, the place where the data runs out and the models stop being reliable guides to what happens next. Science is at its most trustworthy when it tells you exactly where its confidence ends. And on this specific question, about this specific system, the confidence ends sooner than the public conversation usually acknowledges. The real story was never about a magnitude 4.7 earthquake in the Nevada desert. The real story was about what that earthquake reveals, what it tells us about a hidden, interconnected, incompletely understood system of fault zones that is quietly, continuously, doing some of the most consequential tectonic work on the North American continent. A system that most people have never heard of. A system that doesn't make headlines unless it does something drastic, which it hasn't done recently in the modern era, but which the geological record, written in fault scarps and offset ridgelines and displaced stream channels across the Nevada desert, shows it is entirely capable of doing. A system that every moderate earthquake, every magnitude 4, every magnitude 5, every statistically rare event on a named and mapped and formally designated principal fault structure is giving us a small, precious, time-limited window to understand a little better. Those windows don't stay open. The aftershock sequence decays, the geodetic signal fades. The moment when the data is richest and most informative passes, and what isn't captured then may not be recoverable later. Which is why what happens in the weeks immediately following an event like this one matters so much more than the news coverage it receives. The magnitude 4.7 on the Pahranagat Shear Zone is not the end of anything. It's not the resolution of a tension that was building. It's not a conclusion. It's a mid-sentence comma in a very long paragraph that the Earth has been writing for millions of years, and will continue writing long after all of us are gone, long after the cities we've built in the shadow of these fault systems have been replaced by whatever comes next. The stress that drove this earthquake didn't disappear when the fault slipped. It moved. It redistributed into the surrounding crust, changing the loading state of adjacent fault strands, potentially advancing or retarding the timing of events that will occur in this network sometime in the future, on a schedule that the crust keeps for itself and shares with no one. That stress is in the rock right now, propagating, slowly, invisibly, in ways that no instrument currently deployed can fully track, loading faults that may respond in weeks or months or years or decades, or not within any human lifetime. We don't know which fault responds next. We don't know when. We don't know how large the response will be when it comes. What we know is that the system is active. We know it is connected in ways that individual fault models don't fully capture. We know it is doing something right now that our best current models describe only approximately. And we know that understanding it better, really understanding it, at the level of mechanistic detail needed to make accurate probabilistic forecasts rather than broad statistical guesses, requires exactly the kind of sustained, patient, data-driven scientific attention that a brief news cycle, by its nature, can never provide and has never been designed to provide. The detail everyone skipped was the most important part of the story. The fault nobody reported on is one of the principal earthquake-producing structures in the southern Great Basin, sitting at a structural relay junction between two of the most significant tectonic systems in the American West. The timing nobody thought was worth a second paragraph places this event in the context of a possible regional stress redistribution pulse in a fault network that absorbs 20% of an entire continental plate boundary, and the proximity that nobody wanted to lead with, to one of the most monitored, most seismically instrumented, most scientifically studied and historically loaded pieces of desert in North America, means that the data needed to understand what just happened is almost certainly sitting in a server somewhere right now, waiting to be processed, waiting to be analysed, waiting to tell us something. We don't yet know about a system we haven't yet fully mapped, and may not fully map within the careers of the scientists currently working on it. Because the real story isn't the earthquake. The real story is what moves next, and that story is still being written right now, in the crust beneath the Nevada desert, in a language made of stress and strain, and slow, invisible deformation that operates on timescales no headline can follow and no news cycle can contain. A language that most of us will never see directly, unless we pay close attention to the moments when it speaks in a frequency we can hear. A magnitude 4.7, a chandelier swaying on the 40th floor of a Las Vegas hotel, a seismograph needle drawing a line that most people will never look at. These are the moments when the system surfaces briefly into human perception before sinking back into its long, patient, geological silence. That was a magnitude 4.7. Statistically rare on this fault, structurally significant in this network, temporally interesting in this sequence, and almost nobody noticed. Pay attention. The Earth always says something before it says everything.